This is a whistle-stop tour of the parts of a medieval manuscript. Parchment, sometimes called vellum, is the skin of a young calf or lamb. Basically, it's a very fine form of leather. The skin is scraped and stretched over a frame. It's whitened and softened with lime and other compounds. Parchment is expensive. A whole flock of sheep would be needed to obtain the parchment for a single Bible. And when you add in the cost of writing and maybe decorating a manuscript, you're looking at a final artifact of considerable value and prestige. The sort of value we attach to a modern book bears no comparison. But parchment is also highly durable. Only a few years ago, a still legible parchment manuscript from the 8th century was found buried in a bog in Ireland. Paper, usually made from rags, was available in medieval Europe from about the 11th century, but it took several more centuries for its use to become widespread. Manuscripts, like most codices, are assembled from booklets, sometimes called quires. You cut your prepared hide into pieces, fold them in half, nestle them into each other like so. These are then sewn together and bound to make the final book. If you look down the spine of any of your own books, you'll probably see similar evidence of booklets. However, there's an important difference between medieval books constructed from these booklets and modern books. Medieval books weren't always bound immediately. There are clear signs in many medieval manuscripts that individual booklets or groups of booklets were sometimes read in unbound form, like a modern magazine or pamphlet. It's also important to note that once items were bound into a book, that wasn't necessarily the final form of the volume. Medieval books were far more easy to assemble and disassemble than modern books, and this is again because parchment is much more durable than paper, and it can withstand a lot of stitching and unstitching. Quires and leaves and whole texts could be added and subtracted, so the medieval book is a much more pliable artifact than the modern book. Some books were, of course, carefully planned and intended as fixed and coherent final volumes from the beginning, but others were often compilations of freestanding material units, not necessarily in their final form. Medieval readers must have had a very different set of ideas about what a book was than we do. The bindings of medieval books, where there were any, could vary dramatically from single sheets of vellum to casings of precious metals. It's in the bindings that the most immediate sign of the prestige and role of the book is visible. Medieval bindings also give us our clearest indication of the book as an artifact, as an object of admiration and material appeal in its own right. One of the most famous examples are girdle books seen here. These books functioned almost like pieces of clothing, a fashion statement that also proclaimed the wearer erudite or devout. Lower grade books could also be worn for ease of transport and consultation. A doctor might well hang an almanac from his belt to consult quickly, in the same way we'd whip out an iPhone. To us, this would be really a notebook, not a book, strictly speaking, but in a culture where all volumes are handwritten, that distinction isn't all that clear. In similar vein, some books blur the line between jewellery and text, as in this tiny gold-bound psalter given by Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn. Another aspect of writing medieval books that I'd like to draw attention to here is design and layout. Some of the most stunning painting of the Middle Ages survives within the pages of books. Again, modern books do not usually have this sort of craft and artistic labour lavished on them. Text and image are much more closely intertwined in many medieval books than they are in modern ones. Because writing by hand was so much more flexible than printing, a single medieval text can be written in various scripts of various sizes. Here's the opening of a work by Chaucer, first in a deluxe copy and secondly in a lower grade copy. And it's quite important to ask, I think, what difference this varied presentation makes in how the reader is cued up to approach the text. The level of decoration and the overall quality of manuscripts can give us some idea also of the social aspirations of their owners or readers. Even the written parts of the book could be adapted in complex ways through the use of coloured ink. For most of the history of modern print, such variation in colour was labour-intensive and expensive, therefore rare. Our modern term rubric comes from the Latin word for red and relates to the use of red ink to highlight headings or instructions or key passages in medieval manuscripts. Here's a page from the only surviving manuscript of Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, the Winchester manuscript. Throughout this manuscript, proper nouns, particularly personal names, are written in red. What might this use of colour have suggested to early readers? Names are certainly very thematically important in romance. They're carriers of a knight's reputation. Might the rubricator therefore be reflecting a sense of the importance of chivalric repute in this text? Medieval books can also employ a large range of complex layouts. Pages can display multiple interacting layers of meaning. For instance, this is a commentary wrapped around a central text. Medieval manuscripts, particularly religious manuscripts, were often heavily glossed or annotated by scribes. Glosses or annotations can be interlinear, i.e. between the lines, or marginal, in the margins. In modern printed texts, the closest thing is footnotes, or in digital texts, hyperlinks. Vernacular literary texts were less subject to this sort of glossing and annotation, but it can happen on occasion. Chaucer's Wife of Bath's prologue, a text which in fact engages with the idea of glossing at some length, is heavily glossed in Latin and in English in several early manuscripts, and Chaucer may well be the source of these glosses. So even from this short overview, it's quite clear that medieval manuscripts were very different from modern books, and their material and visual characteristics fed into the meanings of the texts they contained in some quite fascinating ways.